Hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Anna Nelson. I'm a New Jersey Peace Action Board member. And we welcome Dr. Matthew Breay Bolton as our keynote speaker today. Dr. Bolton was part of the team from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. This treaty is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, or the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons with the goal of their total elimination. It was entered into force on January 22nd, 2021. The team focused on the damaging humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons, including the effects of nuclear testing. A professor of political science at Pace University, Dr. Bolton co-directs the International Disarmament Institute at Pace with his wife, Dr. Emily Welty, also a professor at Pace and fellow ICAN team member. His work has also addressed the humanitarian impact of landmines and cluster munitions, as well as communities affected by nuclear weapons internationally and in New York City. In 2023, Dr. Bolton was appointed to New York City's newly formed Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Advisory Committee. He is also author of several books on landmines and disarmament. Now we would like to present the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award to Dr. Bolton. So I'm presenting the Dorothy Eldridge Peacemaker Award to Matthew Breay Bolton for his steadfast dedication to champion nuclear disarmament, environmental justice, and a greener world. Congratulations.
All right, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm extraordinarily grateful and so inspired to be among you, both in reading the program here and understanding all the good work that you're doing, and then hearing all the other people who have been up here, the music, the radicalism, the witness, the insistence on being heard. All of these things, I feel very grateful to be among people who are making sure that our decision makers stay accountable and connecting peace and social justice issues in such creative and thoughtful ways. And so I'm so happy and grateful for this award, but also just to be among you in community. And my topic for today is about dreaming, about greenness, and about justice. And in that mind, I feel so excited about this cover. I hear this, the artist might be among you.
No, he didn't make it.
But that's great. Nonetheless, the art is here. So this is a beautiful illustration, I think, of some themes that I want to talk about. In thinking about how to imagine a world outside of the deeply troubled space that we live in today. Traditional nuclear weapons policy making and sometimes activism in this country, as well as others, has often focused on a kind of future point that is disconnected from the grounded reality of what nuclear weapons have already done. So there's a tendency, for instance, to think about it as a security issue, maybe a peace issue, rather than a human rights issue in the present. right? Or is it an environmental issue that is already happening? And I am inspired by your particular approaches of the many different things you're up to, right? Of connecting nuclear weapons issues to the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, to ICE, right? To militarism more generally. And I want to encourage that. So I'm giving a speech here not to tell you what you're doing wrong, but rather to encourage and give sustenance, if I can, to the very work that you're already doing. So examples of how this kind of traditional understanding of arms control has been baked in, if you will, to the international system is like the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT Treaty, that will be having its review conference, probably quite an unpleasant one, to be honest, this month, here in New York City. I know this is not New York City, but here nearby. And many other agreements, but just let's take the NPT as an example, has no material assistance to people who have been affected by nuclear weapons. Right? So there's no provision in the NPT of medical care for the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings in 1945. And what other, when we think about law and policy, what other law and policy would ever have something, would we pass that wouldn't have something for the people most affected by it? Right? Nuclear weapons is often cut off from the reality of the actual weapons, the actual problem that we don't do in other forms of policy. And it's strange. Another example, in 1996, you could say that was in the 60s, maybe the 60s were different, right? But 1996, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, right? That was brought about in part by the activism, maybe some of you here in this room, as well as nuclear-affected communities in the west of this country and also in the Pacific and elsewhere who really pushed for this to happen. It has no provisions whatsoever to help communities that were on the front lines of nuclear testing. The veterans who were part of it, right? The people who have had to clean up the mess. There's nothing in the treaty for them. It is just simply, and this is not to say that it's a bad treaty, I think it's quite useful. It bans nuclear testing comprehensively, and I think at this particular moment it's a useful treaty to remember.
Yes.
However, why does it not include anything for those who are most affected? It's strange. But I think the function of this is that it turns nuclear weapons into an esoteric interest. You may have already experienced this if you've been part of peace action, that it can be quite hard to talk about nuclear weapons with ordinary people, quote unquote, right? People don't feel a sense of connection to it. It seems something far off, something distant, something strange, something kind of Dr. Strangelove, if they have that reference at all. Maybe something that's about video games. But it feels like a future-oriented, oddball topic. Right, full of jargon, full of expert language that's disconnected from people's deeply lived reality on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's not, I'm not a conspiratorial person, but don't think it's not on purpose, right? To disconnect people from a sense of what these things can do to us. And part of this, I think, is also, and there's a risk, even in the anti-nuclear movement, of depicting nuclear weapons as an apocalyptic threat, right? A threat of the future, a threat of this horrifying vision of what they could do to us. And I'm not saying that that isn't true. It is possible, right? When we talk about things like nuclear famine, I think that the scientists tell me that could happen, right, if there is a nuclear exchange. However, I think the impact of that is it really is disempowering to people. People don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about that, right? And it feels, when I've been in rooms where the kind of effects of a future use of nuclear weapons are discussed, people just are sad and really disempowered. And they walk out of the room being like, well, that was depressing, right? And they don't want to do anything about it. Right? Because they want to do something where they feel a sense of agency, a sense of hope, a sense of engagement. And I don't think people, that feeling is not wrong, actually, I think, even though it's frustrating for those of us who work on these issues. I think where I found the most help in thinking about this is a paper I read by Kyle White, who's a scientist, an Anishinaabe scientist who was a former advisor to the White House, not this one, on climate issues. And he writes that for many people, the climate change is not a future apocalypse. Environmental apocalypse for some people has already happened. For his people, right, native peoples of this continent, the environmental apocalypse happened 500 years ago, right? The Columbian Exchange, which is a euphemism for colonialism, right? For many people, they were already torn from their lands and put somewhere else, and then had to figure out how to make a living, how to live on the land that wasn't theirs, right? And so, to paraphrase Kyle White, if I can borrow from him, I think for many people, the nuclear apocalypse already happened. It's already done. It's already occurred. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it already happened. The apocalypse is 85 years old, or 80, years old. Recently, over the last 10 years, I've been visiting communities in the Pacific region that were affected by nuclear testing. So, for example, I visited Kiribati, which is, for those of you who don't know how it's spelled, it looks like Kiribati, but it's spelled Kiribati. Many people don't know much about Kiribati, but it is a country that is both affected by the climate crisis, in that it is a low-level atoll country, coral atoll islands that will be affected, are already being affected by the rising sea levels. But also the US and the UK tested something around 30 atmospheric nuclear tests on Christmas Island in the Pacific. And visiting there was so strange in the sense that 30 nuclear weapons is a lot. And many people around the world have never even heard of the place, right? And I think that there's something really strange about that. But I talked to people, before I went, people said, you'll find it very hard to meet people who lived during that time. It was a long time ago, probably people have moved on. They all live in the same neighborhood. They're all there. Right, they're all people who, and then the neighborhood developed during the time of the test period, right? So I talked to people, and they're still deeply affected by this experience that they had, where the British troops that were on the island literally chose the test site, by the way, the officer, over gin and tonic. Right? Like, that's how cavalier and casual it was all. A real kind of colonial attitude to the island. And then people were gathered in the main square in the village there, and were given some blankets to protect them. Right? So, told not to look, and one kid did and was blinded. Right? Like, these are horrifying experiences. I won't give you too many more of these, because I think these are stories that tell damage rather than our desire. And I want to focus, like Eve Tuck is an indigenous native Alaskan thinker who says, be careful about narrating damage rather than what we want. But I think we acknowledge the damage, right? Another example, visiting the Marshall Islands, again, the testing program, 67 atmospheric nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in the waters, that occurred in those islands. And it's not an old issue, even though it feels like an old issue. Because people are still living with the legacies of it. People can't go home. Their islands have been irradiated by the United States government, and they can't go back there. And so they're stuck on other islands that they don't have the capacity to live on, because they have deep, rich knowledge of how to fish in lagoons. But if you're from Bikini Atoll, which was an atoll with a lagoon, and you're moved to a different island that doesn't have a lagoon, you now don't have the deep, rich knowledge you had of how to stay alive, and so become dependent on other forms of food, such as food assistance from the US government, which may or may not arrive on time, and is like processed food that gives you diabetes. And for older folk who were there during the time of the nuclear tests, there are no oncologists in the Marshall Islands. There isn't one. Right? And so if you get cancer, which if you are exposed to radiation, you have a higher risk of getting it, you have to go to Hawaii or to Taipei. Those are your options if you're on the government health insurance plan. And those are both very, very far away from your family. Right? And the government insurance plan allows you to take one family member with you to help perhaps with translation. You're in hospitals where they don't speak your local language, right, your native language of Majol. And there's a cap on how much they will provide, $100,000. If you pay into the extra insurance, you might get more. But $100,000 does not go very far in cancer care, right? And so, isn't it bizarre that these systems and treaties that were put in place to manage the nuclear arms race did nothing for the Marshallese people? Other example, in what the French would like us to call French Polynesia, and people who are from there call Maui Nui. Research just down the road here at Princeton showed that, contrary to the claims of the French, everyone who was in those islands during the 1960s was exposed to ionizing radiation, right? Elevated ranges. The French have done almost nothing to help people. They have a compensation program as of like 15 years ago. The Princeton study estimates about 100,000 people were probably affected. Maybe 10,000 would be eligible for the eligibility requirements that the French government has listed. The French have compensated 400 people. Because it's almost impossible to figure out, right? Like, if you don't speak French, you can't fill out the forms. If you don't speak legal French, you can't fill out the forms, right? Like, you have to find a lawyer who can actually understand the ridiculous things. There's all kinds of strange thresholds, right? That you have to have match certain dose requirements that mean nothing in a single human body. And then we know that these are gendered. So the impact of ionizing radiation is different for children, it's different for adults, it's different for people on different kinds of diets, it's different for men and women. But there's a single standard, right, that they apply, which is discriminatory. And it's not just a faraway issue. The extensive stationing of nuclear weapons and mining and milling and machining extends the kind of skein of connections to our backyard, right? So there is a site associated with the Manhattan Project that's still being cleaned up in Deepwater, New Jersey, near the Delaware Memorial Bridge, right? There recently did finish cleaning up a missile site, the Beaumont missile site at McGuire Air Force Base, that was a missile caught on fire, right? And scattered plutonium across that missile base. It was cleared up, apparently. Right? But these are materials that don't just disappear, they have to be moved around. And often we see with cleanup efforts, they get moved to more marginalized places. Right? So like there was uranium from the Manhattan Project was stored in Chelsea in New York City during the 1940s. And that has been cleared up by the Department of Energy, but that radioactive material has been moved to the Hanford Reservation, which is in the Pacific Northwest and is indigenous territory that has been seized from people there. So even though all of that is kind of unsettling, at the least. is kind of unsettling, at the least. I think in those connections we can see the potential for action. And solidarity. We can find linkages to this fear of, rather than seeing this kind of a fear of an apocalypse, finding linkages to our local politics, right? That the grounded realities that nuclear weapons have already had in our communities, right? And using that as a way into understanding and building linkages with other people who are also affected by nuclear contamination and violence around the world. And one way to do that is to see it as a kind of environmental justice concern that I think the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that you heard a little bit about can help us do. Because it's negotiated at the UN in 2017. It includes provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation. And so that is a different element of this treaty from other ones. My frustration is that there's not been a lot of that done yet, but it's there. And it forms a kind of basis on which we can try to connect with others. And the more time I've spent in communities affected by nuclear weapons, they've challenged me not to see them as victims, because they actually have much to teach us about how to survive and resist this nuclear age. We can learn from engagement and support with people who are most affected. And I'm looking at the time, just making sure, but I do have a diversion, a tangent, brief, about bears. Yes, you heard me correctly. Indigenous frontline communities that I have engaged with on nuclear issues have taught me to consider the land itself and the beings on it as not separate from people. Exactly. Right? So the idea, even in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that has victim assistance and environmental remediation, separates out people from the environment in ways that is a kind of Western conception of the world. And I have been engaged in studying at SUNY ESF, upstate New York, and working with the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment to try to understand this viewpoint better. Because I, as an English person or English and American person of European descent, I've not understood this kind of way of thinking very well. And so around the time that I was doing these studies, I was hiking in Glacier National Park in Montana, and I saw a sign at the trailhead that said, "You are now entering grizzly country. Enter at your own risk," right? Essentially, the National Park Service cannot guarantee your safety here. And as an international relations scholar, I was like charmed by this. Because what is grizzly country? Do you need a visa? I think it's fantastic and marvelous and sort of so absurd that the federal government essentially is ceding sovereignty over by saying, like, we don't control this area. They're saying, like, this bear is apparently in charge. And this is funny because when you look at the, like, intellectual, if we can use that word, the people who gave the intellectual heft to the nuclear age, right? The people who designed nuclear deterrence, who thought about how the world works and modeled it and said nuclear weapons are the thing that will keep us safe, they don't think about bears. And I know this sounds slightly strange, but stick with me. So for example, Kenneth Waltz, who was at Columbia University, one of the kind of key thinkers about nuclear deterrence, is also a kind of key thinker in post-World War II international relations theory. He said that the world has three levels to politics: man, the state, and war. Right? That man is the lowest level of political agency. I'm guessing, based on the very active political agency in this room, that it's not just men. But also, as you look at bears, for instance, and the way that they get in your trash, right? They don't follow local garbage regulations, right? that they have an agency in the world, right? And then you think about the state, and that the state is not the only way to be sovereign. That the federal government recognizes this animal as challenging itself. And then there is not only war. Most countries, most of the time, don't fight each other. Some do, some more than others, but most don't. And even with the so-called violent threat of a bear, most times we encounter a bear and we don't hurt them, and vice versa, right? There's a way to coexist. And so what I think is funny is that the people like Kenneth Waltz, the people who designed nuclear deterrence, called themselves realists, but they actually often didn't think about much of reality. They modeled it out. They left it out. There were no bears. There were no women. There were no indigenous people. And everyone was fighting each other all the time. And that isn't the reality that many of us live in. It is a reality that exists, but it's not the whole of the story. And so I think we have to have the courage to reimagine that. To reimagine the way that we structure our politics, our security, our relationship with the land, with other people, with the more than human world. And we don't, luckily, have to start from scratch, because you all have been imagining for a while and are trying to make it work. And also, there are people who have already been through the nuclear apocalypse who have survived. And they have thought through ways to keep going, to pass down those stories, to pass down their culture, to tell the ways that they figured out how to evacuate from islands, to keep singing the songs that were meaningful songs to them, to retell the stories and the poetry and the legends that mean things to them, and abide in this deeply awful time that we live in. They've learned to survive, to care for each other, and to resist. And what can we do? I think we can connect with them, because we also are living in the backyard of nuclear problems. And we can find ways, I think, to recover those nuclear stories that are right here amongst us, and figure out how to connect to them, because often those nuclear sites, by the way, are in places where there are other environmental justice problems. Right? They're often overlaid with chemical and industrial sites and pollution that has other people working on those things, and we can lend our solidarity with them to make connections to people who are affected. It also means we can reach out across the divide of, I am a pacifist, but I believe that nuclear veterans deserve justice, right? And compensation and medical care. We can reach out across those political divisions too, to follow the fuel chain, to make connections to other people's nuclear stories, and to see how our futures are linked, to seek justice and redress and make alliances to be able to do that. And so to imagine, I think, a future of nuclear justice that is not just in the abstract, but is enacted in the spaces that we already have agency. And for some of us, that might be at the global level, through treaties like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that will have its review conference at the end of this year. And I think that will be a deeply hopeful space. Some people, it will be at the national level. You were talking about your congressional representatives, right? And other people, it might be at the local level. The national level might be things like getting elected officials to sign off on expansion of RECA, which is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or nuclear disarmament bills. But it could also be hyper-local. And I want to end here by just briefly talking about what has happened in New York City. In 2019, the City Council member Danny Drum put before the Council resolutions and a bill on nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament, and that passed in 2021. And it included a call on the City Pension Fund to divest from nuclear weapons. That hasn't happened yet, but the political statement is there, and it's something that we can continue to follow up about. Mark Levine, who was the city comptroller, was in the council at the time, and he voted in favor of it, or at least didn't vote against it, because it was a voice vote. Also, the advisory committee that we have is getting local government involved. And there's something really fascinating I've found about getting civil servants' teeth into this issue. To think about what does the local government have agency over, and once it's in like a civil servant's portfolio, they just kind of keep working on it. And it's really fascinating to see, to sit at a table with people from the health department, people from the fire department, people who are emergency planners, and talk about how do we keep New York City free of nuclear weapons. And we were inspired by some of the precedent here in this state, right? That you have in places like New Jersey, in Jersey City and Hoboken, really good laws from the 80s, and they're still on the books, and they're actually fantastic pieces of legislation that are very carefully crafted and could be revived and reaffirmed. And New Jersey itself, as a state, has passed a resolution supporting the TPNW, and so I want you to think about how can you invigorate these kinds of action at the local level and beyond. So thank you very much for taking time to listen to me. I'm deeply impressed and inspired by all the work that you're doing, and all the very best. And you have my solidarity. Much courage to you.